Good morning, fellow islanders. It seems we're blessed with yet another hot house of a day here on our precious island. Sunny skies, 86 degrees, and 100% humidity. Good times. Don't forget sunscreen and bottled water. The Sheriff's Department continues to suffer on mass resignations, apparently because of low wages and abysmal working conditions. Deputy Lacrosse told St. Monique Morning Post, blaming it on City Council. Ever so eloquent, he went so far as saying, "Sincerely hope you don't get burglarized, Mayor. Because soon, mark my words, there won't be any officers left to protect this island." Harsh words. Lock your doors, people. Finally, the new highway Reed up north is back on track after last week's protests and is expected to be finished before year's end. Now, here's some more music. Carl, did you feel that? Was that a quake?
Good morning, ladies and gents. Before you is Winston Green. Seems like a regular Joe, doesn't he? But don't let his unexceptional demeanor fool you. Hidden beneath that everyday facade is a mind sharp as a tack and nimble as a fox. He's a whiz kid, an engineer savant, they say. Just imagine him in the throes of slumber, his rest disturbed only by the jangle of a confounded alarm clock. But it seems to be a bit busted. I wonder why. Oh, there goes another one. But as you see, dear friends, that's the beauty of Winston. He's like a fine piece of equipment, with just a few loose screws. No job to his name, and a temper hotter than a jalapeno on the sun. But such talent. If only he could put it to use.
Now, where did I put that three-piece suit? A red envelope. Could only mean one of two things. Secret admirer, or someone wants to murder me. Miss Landlord. Definitely a love letter. Let's see. 3 months overdue on rent. Yeah, I got till end of next week. Great. Another one for the pile. Yep, honeymoon's definitely over. This is my journal. I don't go anywhere without it. Definitely not for publication. I used to scribble down my engineering notes back in the day. Now it mostly contains my thoughts.
With the help of We Deliver, anyone can enjoy the luxuries of the mainland. We deliver anything, anywhere. I, Harold F. Girther, guarantee it.
Seeing as the island's unemployment rate is higher than ever, you will be happy to know We Deliver is hiring. Hurry over to their main office now on 13 Farrell Street.
So, a couple of years back, all roads led me to St. Monique. That's where everything kicked off. The Girther clan, they were the talk of the town. The big man himself, Harold, practically had a halo around his head in these parts. He's a chip off the old block, as far as visage goes, at least. Donovan, well, he was a piece of work. Iron-willed, ruthless, and stiff as a redwood. I should go there ASAP. Desperately need a job. Where'd I put the damn keys this time? Breathe, Winston. You know what? Screw it. Not as if my life hasn't been completely stripped clean anyways. Bingo!
This brings back memories.
Easy, friend.
I don't have anyone to call right now.
Oops, sorry.
Bingo!
Watch your step.
Excuse me.
On a mission, huh?
Well, this car, it's Mr. Palmer's, my somewhat eccentric neighbor. He lets me use it now and then, all for just bringing him his groceries. He's often up on the roof after sunset. Odd habit.
Tax is up again.
Space, please.
Stop talking trash.
Watch your step.
Oops.
Go, go, go.
What was the name of that company again? We Deliver? I should head there. Hopefully they still have a spot open. I guess I can always check the tourist map if I lose my way.
Yikes! Heyday! Jackpot. Wow. Ow!
Careful, sport.
In a rush, are we?
In a rush, are we?
Damn.
Oh, peculiar place.
Please don't step in it.
Right. Hi. Where can I find the administrator?
Which one? The nice one? Or the asshole?
Oh, the gee, I don't know, the former? Looking for a job.
Desk, warehouse, or courier work?
There was an ad on the radio?
Ah, Harold then. Good for you. At the stairs, 1 floor, office. Can't miss it.
Thank you.
Oh, and please don't step in it.
2nd floor it is then.
Waiting on my next delivery.
That might be just what I need. Oh, a tool chest. I wonder what's inside. Exactly what I needed, I think.
This door, perhaps?
Oh, this should come in handy.
Hey, I'm working here.
Ooh, this coffee hits the spot. Hope the boss likes this report.
Remember, this is your life now. Wonder what Winston from 2 years ago would say if he knew.
Come in.
Here goes nothing.
Yes? Can I help you, young man? Yeah, shoot. Where are my manners? Harold F. Girther, CEO, but you can call me Harold. To what do I owe the pleasure?
Winston. Sir, Winston Green. I heard an ad on the radio. Said you're hiring?
On the radio? This morning, you mean? Wait. That was a while ago. They must have mixed their tapes up. How embarrassing.
You mean there's no job?
Oh, I'm sorry, son. You're not from here, are you?
Well, actually, I grew up on a farm, sir. A couple of hours south of New Reed.
Ah, a farmer's boy. Oh, necessity is the mother of invention,
Place is a goner now, though. The highway project saw to that.
Oh, that damned highway. Winston, this is Donovan, my son. Donovan, this is Winston Green. He came here looking for work, but...
We're not hiring right now, remember? Christ, don't tell me it's that damn radio ad again. It seems like you're out of luck, Mr. Green. Hope that damn host chokes on his mic. Anyway, wanted to remind you about that report. You know, Allison, hate to fly up there empty-handed next week.
Donnie Sharp, good with numbers. However, a business is more than that. It's about reciprocity, community, people, trust. Tell you what, I've got an idea. Go down to storage, find Johnny, tell him Harold sent you to run a few deliveries, and he'll set you straight. In the meantime, I'll make some calls. When you're done, return to me and we'll work something out.
I thank you, sir.
Least I could do. Good luck, son.
Where's Johnny?
Ah, you must be Winston. I'm Johnny, the linchpin of operations here at We Deliver. You see, I'm the one who orchestrates the flow of everything, from the tiniest paperclip to the largest orders. You'll be receiving your assignments directly from me. It's crucial to understand that I have refined these processes to perfection over my years here. Adherence to my methods is not just expected, it's essential for our collective success. Remember, Winston, in this pond, I'm the one who keeps the ecosystem balanced. I look forward to seeing if you can swim with the current. A company car is parked outside. Go find it, and I'll call you on the radio with instructions for your first delivery.
Gee whiz, smells like a fish market in here.
Winston, there is a parcel waiting for you at a shop at the north side of St. Monique City. The Palm Royal are preparing for their big Vicennial celebrations. You are to transport something they ordered as part of their grand finale.
Oh, crap.
Excuse me.
Oh, you're here to pick up the Kiloton Calamity? Great, it's out back. Where do you need me to sign? Just wait for a moment before you load it up, okay?
Huh. Okay.
Seems my time at the farm was good for something.
That was weird.
Oh, shit!
This is the end. Got a firm grip. Face the music. Take that. I won't let go.
Get the water! Jeez!
Are you sure that I should sign for this, sir? I'm just a bellboy, and this doesn't seem right.
Can you believe that the customer paid extra for additional packaging, Winston? What nonsense! I ignored that, of course, and was able to save money for the company. A good businessman is always searching for ways to save money, Winston. Remember that.
The next delivery.
Yeah, not bad. Still dealing with flu that won't go away. What is this game? Deliver at all costs. It's free on.
Winston, there is a customer with a parcel waiting for you outside of the Sunset Sip.
The Sunset Sip. It's a free game. Yes. It's a free game. I would say try it out. I'd crash. It's pretty chill. Ooh, money. I down. Oh my god. I downloaded this shit too. Looks like a modernized Paperboy or something. I never played that game. I'm looking way more forward to that. Yeah, same. That game is gonna be hella hard, and I am prepared to take on the challenge. It's gonna be stupid hard, and I'm ready for it. I am super ready for it. I don't know where I'm going. I'm looking at the map. I grab on every game I see free on Epic. Nah, some of them. Most of them are not that good. Sure, so sexy, it makes me rock. Alright. How are you feeling, Tartar, besides just having the flu? How are you doing besides being sick? I know, but I still brought them. I feel that. They are free, so why not? I get it. Park in front of the melon. Okay. Where them? Oh. I need to reverse the car. Okay. Mind you, I don't have a real life license. Oh shit. Okay. Guys, come on! Get out of my way! Oh, no. Did it! Exactly, or I'll do a series where I play garbage games one day. Those are pretty fun. Am I supposed to jump in the dumpster? Load cargo onto... Oh, okay. I'm supposed to load this onto the truck. Well, that didn't really go as planned, but alright.
Hey, buddy, what's your name?
Winston, at your service.
How you doing, Kat?
Pleasure
Thank you
to
for
meet
being in
Winston.
here.
First off, I need you to drive to Sunkissed Farms.
Sunkissed Farm. That's kind of weird. Why are you delivering garbage? Oh, I didn't keep them on the truck. Oh shit. Okay. Ooh.
How am I supposed to make any money back when you turn the cargo into a fruit slurry?
I had to keep them on the truck, and I didn't realize that. Okay, so I gotta be very cautious.
Never mind what the old broad says. We'll find a buyer. Just you wait.
I can't even turn roughly. Like, I gotta be very careful.
Just a scratch.
Yep, just a scratch. Oh my god. You make no sudden mistakes. I just made a mistake. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Damn,
There's nothing
damn,
wrong with these foods
damn.
that can't be fixed with a bit of razzle dazzle.
This is harder than it looks. $48 out of 20. That's nice. That's vandalism. Old. Would y'all want to see me play Snafu? Because I will try it. I haven't tried it yet. Oh, okay, okay, okay. Oh, damn it! I lost one. Lost one.
Bingo!
Free money. $10, baby. You just gotta take it nice and easy. Very cautious. Can't make any sudden mistakes. Damn, damn. Fuck my life. Damn.
Easy money.
Damn, bro! Damn, at least I have 27 left. Oh god. Okay. Oh, 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 oh. I'm driving on the fence practically.
Buddy
Okay, I
of
made
mine
it.
works here. Says I can borrow their pesticide washer. No problem.
Oh, you bastard. I gotta... Oh, Jesus. I gotta do it. Oh, crap. Okay. Okay. I'm dropping any of them.
Oh, I'm rich.
I need to drive backwards. Because sometimes it just go to waste. We did it! Yay. W.
They're going through. Hurry up and catch them.
FBI, open up!
Well, what's it doing? I don't know. Collect. Oh, I gotta collect them. That scared me. That scared you? Sorry.
I should use the company car.
Am I supposed to pick these up? I'm confused. What's happening? Oh. Oh my. Okay.
Damn.
Oh my god. This driving is not easy, dude. You did. A little bit. Oh, okay. This is a weird task. I want to see how many I can carry back. Or am I just supposed to bring him more? I don't know.
That takes care of the smell. Next up is Dave's Dies.
Okay, this is not easy, dude. I've already lost like 3 of them, and I just turned. Okay. Ooh. This is a slight hill. Oh my god! How far do we have to drive? I lost one. Jesus. I'm not doing sit-ups right now. Fuck you. No. No. I already did sit-ups earlier. I do them later. Now I'm driving a truck full of watermelons. Why are we doing workout? would you guys really want a full? Would you want a full workout stream, like a full on workout, like nothing else besides working out? Would you actually want that? Thank God I didn't lose any more. I had 40 left.
Hey, Freddy, old buddy.
20 sit-ups.
Come on, Winston, get going. I can only keep him distracted for so long.
How are you guys spending your Sunday? Ooh. Oh, that was not great. I want to learn how to drive. Head up some weeks, let's go. Pull the lever on the tank. Oh, I gotta climb the fence. The fence, I gotta climb the ladder. Are we out? We moving. No, don't climb back down. Who's that? You just stole my truck.
Look at that
Oh,
marvelous
I got
shot.
scared.
Now, bring them over to the Sunset Sip.
We know each other. I'm like, he about to take my truck. Give me a minute. Just started driving.
How am I supposed to make any money back when you turn
I'm
the
not gonna lie, I
car into a fruit
thought I
salad?
had that turn, but then I just came to a complete stop, and he gave me more. That's nice of him. Thank you. You can see the game now. Oh my god! Didn't know there was a hill. I'm doing so good right now. I made it. Safe and sound, baby. Pacific Boardwalk. That'll be 8 o'clock. Oh! Major melon misfortune. Thank God we didn't lose all 20. That still going the wrong way. Nope, now I'm reversing. Nope. God damn it. Driving is hard.
How am I supposed to make any money back when you turn the cargo into a fruit slurry?
I can't drive, sir. Have you seen my turns? They're crazy. It's just like I'm playing Need for Speed right now. I think I made it. Oh god. I'm just gonna break this fence. That actually worked. I'm surprised. But we made it! Let's go, we made it.
Let's settle this.
Made it safe and sound. Did you just punch me? How can I kick people?
Cut it out.
Yeah, you bum. Who's she? Hello?
Oh, now these look excellent. I hope this taught you a valuable lesson about trying to get past me with inferior merchandise.
Thanks a bunch, partner. I'm off to celebrate this little caper with a drink. I'll probably choose some other joint, though.
Where are we going to next? Delivered! Time passed 14:55. Respawns 3 times. How much money did we get from that delivery?
Till we deliver.
He should make one for we can spam it and make him work out. And see how he likes it.
Oh, jeez.
I don't mind working out. It's just my body is it's disproportionate. So it's like one leg is Whenever I start doing IRL streams, we cannot have that alert on. That would drive me insane.
What the hell?
When we start doing IRL streams, that sound alert will make
Mr.
me
Green, was it?
jump in front of a
Seems
car.
you're late. My father used his Harper a compass once again, I see.
He insisted I be compensated for today's misunderstanding.
Well, he is a gentleman. This morning, couldn't shake a feeling of deja vu. Do I know you from somewhere?
Doubt it, sir. I'm from a
farmer's boy, south of New Reed, I heard. Well, Hannesburg, Copperhead?
Tannerson.
Is that right? Oh, interesting.
Yeah? Why is that?
Not a lot of...
Winston, you're back. How did it go?
Well, all things considered,
he's
terrible.
Give the man a break, Donnie. Remember your first day here.
Hardly comparable. Oh, wait a second. What do you mean, first day?
Winston, I've done some thinking. We could use another hand.
For the love of...
Don't mind Donnie, he'll come around, you'll see.
Thank you, sir.
Don't mention it. Well, it's getting late. See you Monday morning?
You bet. Donovan, what's his problem?
The bottom, I'm gonna take it. I ate it already.
Okay. Oh. I'm just eating my burnt food. That I burnt. Kind of. It's okay. It still tastes good. Alright, let's get back to the game. Return to the apartment. My beat up car. It never like rises, so I just be like running it over. Oh, it's not getting enough speed. Oh, I lost my car.
Yeah, I should have brought my swimming trunks.
Oh, did not know that could happen.
Not so fast, cowboy.
Can I like run back? You think I can take someone else's car? Is that possible? I'm gonna try it out. Well, I don't think a car is gonna stop for me, but let's see. You can't. Stop. Can't, nope. It's not like GTA. You can't steal people's cars. But you can hop on them though. I don't know where he's taking me. And I just find a car in like a parking lot or something. Oh, that was close. What's over here? Grass.
The road is my home.
Because you're a bum?
I saw what you did.
What did I do? I didn't do nothing. I didn't do jack squat. Alright, we can take a car. We can't steal, but we can take any car that nobody is using, but we can't steal. Kinda sucks, but it's whatever. I'm trying like a maniac right now. You heard the gravel break and everything. Honey, I'm home. Imagine. That's just the way that you come home every day. Just crashing into everything.
he's
Oh, it's a ladder up here. What is that, man? It's a weird one. Let's go with this man.
Cha-ching!
Oh, but you can't jump back over, obviously. Okay, I just took a quick nap from what it looks like.
I'm not losing it. Am I?
It seems like you are.
No, there are monstrous worms right beneath us. The kind that gulp you down before you can even blink. They sense every shake, every shudder of the earth. You've got to be crafty, Palmer, if you're going to reach that emergency ration box across the block. Yes, that's it. The rooftops, they are the key.
Didn't I get one last time from there? So return to the apartment. Huh?
You've got to be crafty, Palmer, if you're going to reach that emergency ration box across the block. Yes, that's it. The rooftops, they are the key.
He takes too much drugs. He takes too much drugs.
Letter.
In the next hour, I'm gonna try snafu. I'm just supposed to leave now? Okay.
The Atomic Energy Commission. Frickin' AEC.
Dear Mr. Green, as a matter of national security, your request has been denied. Reckless behaviors cause great harm and forfeits any future rights to demands. The agreement was mutual. Must stress you put this topic to rest, lest we may have to take decisive and irredeemable actions. Government property. So we'll look for other collaborators on future trials.
Stanley Division. I wish I never have to hear that name again.
Investigate letter. Change clothes. You don't have. I don't think he has a lot of clothes since he only got like one small dresser. I don't think he has that many clothes.
It's a long day. Off to dreamland.
That don't look like the same kid at all. Fresh out of the gate.
Winston frequently toiled late into the night, all to occupy his sharp intellect. Consider this rocket, ladies and gentlemen, a true testament to the engineering prowess of its era. Winston, for the most part, chose the solitude of his thoughts. But, dear audience, that was all about to change.
No, thank you. I said no. God damn, coming. What?
That time? I'm here to pick you up.
Norman?
Suffering? I'm Norman.
Winston. Norman, look, I'm sorry about that. You know, I thought it was another one of those doorstep scams.
No, man, my bad. Banging on the door like that? Thought you were asleep. You're a coffee person? Personally, I can't wake up without the dang thing. Whoa! Is that a...
No, it's nothing. It's just a stupid project to...
Mind if I take a look?
I guess?
I don't know what that word is. Logistical?
Dang! Would you look at that shit? I mean, not actual shit. Didn't mean it like that. It's just that it's so... My daughters would go crazy. They're hooked on space, you know. Really impressive model.
Actually, it's a working rocket. Well, supposed to be, anyway.
What, you an engineer or something?
Well, not anymore. I'm not.
That's stupid, man.
Some people would definitely disagree. Hey, look, we should probably get going.
Sure. Just wanna... Oh, man. Just look at all the little...
Wait!
I didn't know it was active.
I'll just... wait outside.
Wow. So now we gotta go retrieve it. Friday, April 10th, 1959, 1 p.m. The buzz around Harlan seems well funded. A true gentleman, really, who offers someone a day's work over a simple mix-up. Not that I'm complaining. Briefly met Donovan too. He's all business. Speaking of which, Johnny and Donovan seems to have that in common. Why does Johnny's truck smell like fish though? Interesting question. Don't know why I smell like fish. Welcome back, Az. Get ready. Go to Norman. Go to Norman. I feel like taking a shower. Chapter 2 already? Damn. Oh, we can just go down these steps. Flamingo
Hey,
Hotel. Motel.
Really sorry about the mess. I will help you fix it.
It's fine.
Promise. I'll make it up to you. By the way, this is yours. Well, not technically yours,
Oh.
but, you know.
I thought, oh, I got my own truck.
Where did you learn that stuff anyway?
Look, it's a long story. It doesn't matter anymore. Different life. What?
No, man. It's just that.
What?
How old are you?
24.
See, I'm 45. When I was over in the Pacific, crawling around like some damn mud skipper in the jungle, trying not to get my head blown off, that's some different life right there.
The hell is a mud skipper?
Yeah, it's, I don't know, like a weird fish. Never mind. That ain't the point, man. Point is, you should be too young to say that, you know?
Well, you'd be surprised. I can't imagine what it must have been like. I'm sorry you had to go through that.
Yeah, not everyone had someone waiting for them back home.
How much time do we have?
That's
Still
true.
got time. Why?
I'll show you.
Drive into garage.
Hell, man. You got your own workshop?
My landlord lets me use it.
Oh, Bessie, sure could use a round in here.
Huh?
My mistress.
Right. Well, I have a little something for the truck I want to try out.
Is it a rocket engine? Seems I'm running low on those.
Touche.
Workshop. Winston can assemble gadgets in his workshop. Utilize blueprints and parts found during your explorations to assemble unique gadget. Okay. Oh, it's like a time lapse or like a stop motion time lapse. I guess. That's it. Okay.
I want to see it in action. Your wish is my command.
So what can we even build? Oh, we got a crane? That's sick. That's awesome.
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah, pretty cool, huh?
Consider my mind blown. Man, can I have
Why
one?
don't we have that now? Like, that's a crazy adventure.
All right, buddy. You've got your gadget, and we've had our coffee. I'd say we're ready to head to We Deliver.
So, let's go.
Damn, I can't drive sim in life. Huh? This way?
You're quite the driver, Winston.
Yes, I am. I'm a perfect driver. I'm an A1 driver, baby. Oh, that's crazy. That's crazy. I just drove on her whole car. Ooh. What about taking this way? What is this? Oh. The best driver in town, bro. You don't know that? I keep missing this box. There we go.
My bad.
I'm the best driver in this town.
Careful.
Good morning.
We made it. Look at that. How fast was that?
Mr. Green, do you have an answer to my question by any chance?
Huh? No, look, we're...
A hint. I'm an animal.
Good God.
I have 3 heads. Cut off 1, I become stronger. Cut off 2, I become 10. Who am I?
Ooh, I got it. May I?
You go ahead, Mr. Johnson.
A fox.
Well, what?
Fox. Cut off 1 letter, you get ox. Cut off 2, you get X. X is 10 in Roman numericals.
Very good.
Oh, that's fire.
Well, you know.
That's actually a good riddle.
Mr. Green, would you like another?
No, thank you.
I messed with that riddle. That is actually clever.
Oh, this looks promising. Oh, what is that smell?
Hot damn, that's foul. Man, look at those 2 fools. Seems I have my work cut out for me. Catch you later, Winston.
Later.
Later. Enter We Deliver. This trash looks gross.
Oh, what the...
Winston. Oh, sweet Lord. Am I glad to see you.
Oh, jeez, what is that?
Well, if you ever wondered what 10 tons of expired Pacific halibut smells like, this is it. And before you ask, no, there's no market for it. Johnny.
I'll get it under control, sir.
Should we play this again? This game seemed pretty fun, and I will definitely be down to play it
I got the schedule
once again.
mixed up, so it sat here fermenting over the weekend.
Any takers? Any suggestions? Any
Death
backers?
itself died.
Well,
Does anyone care?
we need to find a way to get rid of
Does
it
anyone
before
have
the
an
shipment
opinion?
arrives. Talk to Johnny, he'll fill you in. I need to make some calls. Oh, your uniform is pressed and ready in your locker.
Change to uniform. We got our actual work uniform. We are a part of the job. Talk to Johnny.
Fish smell? What are you fussing about? Now listen up. Just look around at these fine walls. One day my portrait might be hanging here, a testament to success. Right there with the greats, such as the late Gustav Goethe, the visionary founder of We Deliver. Imagine that. Eternally celebrated here at We Deliver. Now, your company car is parked just outside.
This
Once you
is-
settle in, contact me on the radio.
This
I'll be
is-
waiting to give you the details of your next delivery.
This is his only passion in life. Is this company. The only thing he cares about. Parkour!
I should find my pickup truck before I use the radio. Got another delivery for me?
Whoa, client. Henry Thompson. Fishing for love. As hard as it is for me to admit, some real McCoy just beat my Merlin record. Can you believe that, Winston? Perhaps I should start collecting stamps instead. You know what makes it worse? It was done in the name of love. All of things. What a character. What a charlatan. That's something way too long to read, but at least I read it.
It's time to show your mettle. I need you to hightail it to Port Bell pronto.
Port Bell? Aye, aye, sir. Port Bell. Here we come. Let's floor it. I thought that was gonna work out better. No, I think our truck is just too big. Portobello. Just want to do this last mission. Don't want to stay on to the future. I don't usually stream on Sundays, so I don't want to stay on too long. I'll be on Monday for sure, definitely all day. Not all day, but majority of the day.
Would you believe it? Her father. That old salt won't let me court Daisy unless I can prove myself as a fisherman.
Henry, you get turned around in your own bathtub, let alone the ocean.
Not just any fish will do. Only a marlin can make a dent on that man's brow. Especially that elusive white marlin folks been talking about for years. My hard-earned cash and suit might be a spin in the ocean to him, but I'll show him. I ain't no con artist, and you ain't no ordinary career. I can tell. You get it, right? This is the only way for me and Daisy to be together. I need you to make this happen.
I'm on it.
Drop the marlin. A very long ladder. I don't even remember the last time that I even scaled one. Like, those shits pretty scary. Pitter patter, pitter patter, pitter patter. Alright, now what? We talk?
I wish I had more vacation.
What am I supposed to do with this fish?
Jackpot.
I gotta load the marlin onto my truck somehow. Not a box. How would I load a fucking fish? Yeah, I just caused a giant mess. Oh, that's okay. I think I messed up. Royally messed up. So we should try that again. But I don't know how to package it. We're fine. How do I package the fish? Did I mess up the mission? I don't know. Oh!
Oh, and I need you to give it a full paint job.
You got
to
it.
make Daisy's father's jaw drop. My pal, the old wharf, owes me a solid and has left the dip tank open for you.
So we gotta go this way. Ah, that's not where we need to go.
Bingo. The marlin seems to be getting hungry. We must find it a quick snack.
Really? I gotta feed this dumbass fish? Where'd I go to get food? Over here.
The marlin seems to be getting hungry.
I'm trying to figure it out. If I just know how to drive properly, this wouldn't be this difficult. Shut up, lady.
They say love makes you do crazy things. I guess hauling a marlin to a dip tank for a paint job qualifies, right? But for Daisy, it's worth it. Love's all about the grand gestures. Or so the movies say.
This is a crazy game. I know there's like worse, but this game right now, I'm literally crashing into every little thing I can. And everything's just breaking apart, which is very funny. Like everything's breaking. It's awesome.
This is the spot. The dip tank's ready and waiting for your magic touch. Remember, we're not just sprucing up any old fish. This marlin's gotta be a showstopper. Make it look so dazzling that Daisy's old man can't.
We saved the fish.
Whoops.
Didn't we load the marlin? We did. Jesus Christ. Okay, stop. No, damn it. Reverse.
I just hope this works. If her father isn't impressed by this, I don't know what else
We
I
made
can
it
do.
cleaner? I honestly don't know what happened.
My bad.
Coming through, civilians, coming through. Got a big marlin to deliver. I know you don't care, but this is my job on the line, and I need that paycheck, bro. So get the hell out of my way! Or are you gonna pay my fucking rent this month, huh? Don't think so.
You better feed the marlin, or it'll be the end of us. The marlin! It's gone airborne! We can't afford to lose that fish. Please, find it. We need it alive and well.
How'd I get it?
Yikes.
We got the fish back. Should be dead by now. Like, I don't know how it's still alive, but
Feed the marlin! It's planning an escape!
just dry backwards.
I can hardly believe we're doing this. A white marlin, and not just any, but the most stunning one Daisy's father has ever seen.
I don't care about Daisy father, bro. This game is fun. And we need to feed it more whatever.
The marlin is eyeing us for lunch. We better find it a snack fast. Oh, yikes.
Brakes!
The marlin! It's gone airborne! We can't afford to lose that fish. Please, find it. We need it alive and well.
That's scam!
What's your problem?
Try and get this stupid fish. My car's on fire. Okay, that was a nice turn, not gonna lie. That turn was clutch. We saved it! I broke it. We did it, chat. We survived. We did a lot of damage to the city. But the Marlin is saved.
Well, I'll be a monkey's uncle. Henry, you really did it, son. I'd be honored to have a skilled angler like you courting my daughter. But let me tell you, she's a tough catch. Even tougher than the ones we reel in out at sea. Don't get too confident just yet, young fella.
I'm in your debt, Winston. But I've gone and spent every penny on that fish. Should you ever find yourself in Shellington, please make it a point to come find me, won't ya?
Sure, happy to help.
Alright. Cutscene.
If you ever lose this pearl of a car, contact me. Company property is my domain and under my command. Not a single item has been lost. I even found Miss Rover's old lipstick under one of the office desks. Nothing gets by me.
Nothing gets by me. Phone booth. If you lose your company card, you can retrieve it by locating and using a phone booth. They are also visible on the map. We did a second delivery call. Response 0. Marlin dropped 2 times. We made $200. That's nice.
I'm all set for the next delivery.
Right, Winston? Just one delivery left for the day.
Alright, last delivery of the day. Last delivery of the day. You got on my way first. Almost ran him over. I'm the best driver, dude. My skills are for the streets. Need for speed.
As soon as I saw this amazing product, I knew it would be perfect for us. From now on, we'll leave a balloon with every delivery we make. A gift to each of our customers. It'll be
A balloon?
calling card. To begin with, we will hand out balloons to some of our most valued customers. Load that contraption on the car while I get the order form ready.
Load the parcel. Dude, that invention is
What
amazing.
did you do? Never mind how one turns it off. Here is the order form. You better start driving. The first balloon should be delivered to the construction foreman, Bill Johnson, for being a valued customer of Distinguished Strands, crafter of bespoke wings and toupees.
It's making me float. Can I not pop one? Oh! I need to talk to you, sir. Wait, I'm stuck. Excuse me. How did I get... Oh, here's your balloon, sir.
I guess my secret's not so secret anymore, huh?
I guess
My
not.
crew
Just
will
a...
never let this go.
That's a big balloon.
The second parcel should be delivered to the long-haul trucker, Ray Big Rig Thompson, for being a valued customer of Premium Protection, supplier of discreet adult diapers since 1945.
We're taking flight, baby. I'm assuming he's in here. Still lurking and twerking. Appreciate you. I'm about to raid out after this last job.
Easy there, Tiger.
I'll be on again tomorrow. Usually. What do you mean? No, I'm not.
The next one should
Why
be
not?
delivered to Mrs.
Explain.
LeBlanc. She owns that hairdresser salon and has apparently bought a sizable amount of poochies and poodles perfect.
I want
free
Jesus to finish his statement. Ah, shit. I need to keep winking over. That's crazy. Oh, I'm finishing. I'm done. That's crazy. Well, I don't usually stream on Sundays. I usually take that day off to do YouTube stuff.
I'm rich. Jackpot.
I know. I'm going along. Me or you?
And who might might you be, citizen? A concerned local, I presume? Your timely arrival might just save me from the depths of fiscal discussions and expenditure
It's
reports.
1:30. It's
I suppose you've heard
1:30
about the disappearance of my lookalike, Bob.
I appreciate that.
Quite the predicament, isn't it? Bob's absence has left me in a rather
So
unusual position. You see,
it's
citizen,
9:30.
without Bob, I might actually have to sit through the city's
So
budget
what? 10
meeting.
o'clock? 11?
A fate I wouldn't wish upon my staunchest political rival. Please help find Bob, my lookalike. He thoroughly enjoys playing the role of me, the mayor. He's likely roaming the streets of St. Monique City, basking in the admiration of our citizens.
That's a weird thing to do, dude. But okay. You go to bed. How succulent is the sausage, Sergi? That's crazy. Can I at least take a nap? Does that count? What if I take a sleep on stream? What about that? Which I have tried that before. I slept on stream before. Naps equal extra gay? That's crazy. Oh yeah. Can't sleep with the camera on. I done that a couple of times before. Let me see extra close. Let me just peek in real quick, you know?
Why are you giving this to me? How dare you?
Let me just
I would
peek.
never purchase such a product. Get away from my store.
Okay, why you being such a bitch?
Delivery is to Mr. Montgomery.
Yeah,
having
she
bought
rude.
one of each
Ungrateful
item offered
as
a
a
Funky Fix Foot Emporium.
grateful as a woman, I should say. And I wanked you all night. I watched you all night. I'd rather take watch than wank in any circumstance. Any circumstance. This is not how you drive a car, by the way.
Colorful balloons.
This is not how you drive a car. That's probably like $1 billion worth of damage I just caused right there. I would have had that if I just drove correctly and like nice. Don't tell me we'll land on the roof now. Oh. I landed in the house. That's crazy.
Call the cops.
Shut up. Don't call the cops. I'm doing my job. Josh, how many bites do you need to give me to talk? What? George, how many bits do you need to give me to talk? To get used to talking my streams? Oh. You always so focused playing Fragpunk. As you can see, I am. You are oh shit, his grill! Not the grill. Is she blindfolded?
The next balloon should go to room 103.
What's the
that
grill?
miserable hotel.
Let's see, what's a good number? It's like 10 bits.
Recipient is to receive a balloon for having
10
bought no
bits,
less than
you know?
300 portions of Bachelor's Banquet.
10
single
bits.
portion TV dinners during the last year.
You know, run those pockets. You better run those pockets if you have anything. So you give me 10 bits and talking about no. You give me 10 bits and then I talk in your stream. No. You give me bits and not talking your stream. How many bits do you need to give me to talk? That's what got me confused. I'm like, me as in me or as in you? That's where I got confused. I'm like, me? Me as in me or like me like I'm as in you? So yeah. That's how many bits you give me to talk in my stream. You owe me 10 bits. That's when I ever have money caught in 10K. I don't ever have money to give myself bits.
There's still things to do.
So I don't know when I'm gonna give you bits. So you are just going to be waiting for I don't know how long. I got $1. I have $1 in my bank account, and I can even show you to prove it.
You're barking up the wrong tree, my friend. 300, is it?
You
Well,
fake
I
sub
may
last
accept
month.
what you owe to their
I subbed,
convenience, you understand?
and then they told me, oh, I can't sub because I didn't have enough money in my bank account.
Provider of the ultimate lice combating solution.
That's what happens when you try to re-sub, and then you're like, oh, I actually don't have no money in my bank account. So, yeah, that's what happened. I tried to re-sub, and then it told me, I'm like, oh, no, you can't because you have inefficient money. I'm like, oh, well. That's why I use Prime sub.
It's all a matter of perspective.
That's why Prime is free. You are a good delivery driver. I tried my best. Made me believe I was special. I thought I was the one. I was crying for 4 days straight. I made people cry before. And people made me cry, so what can I say? This. Oh, that's crazy. Okay, that's pretty cool. I can send you a text of all my cards. Everything has 0 on it. Everything either has complete nothing or like $1. When I tell you I have no money, bro, I am broke. I've been crying to my cats. At least you have cats.
I should get this back to Mr. Palmer.
I don't have anything. See, Az cares. Thank you, Az. Appreciate you, bro. You're the best. See, Az likes to support. Oh, God. But yeah, I don't know if you were present that day, but I will be starting classes to look. No, well, I'll be starting classes to get a job, which the classes take, I believe, 3 to 4 or 5 months. So
I should use the company car.
That's gonna be a hassle. So yeah. Just letting you know, if you don't see me stream that much, just for a heads up, if you care. I'm floating. I didn't realize I was floating. God, Jesus Christ. This car's in my way. I could have ran him over.
Huh, I'm just scratching because, you know, new hair gel.
I guess.
Right. Only 2 deliveries left, Winston.
Excuse me. Oh, he
This one's
flew.
to Captain Malone of the Blue Horizon. You need to hurry. according to the schedule, the ship is about to leave port. Captain Malone is to receive a prize for having bought the most boxes of Vermex rodent repellent this year.
That's good for him, I guess. That was the best driving I ever done. That was the best driving ever. Jesus Christ. I'm surprised they just keep responding, which is awesome. Did your balloon?
Rodents on board on my ship?
I guess so. I don't know.
Final delivery, Winston. This one is to Helen Hardhat Bennett at Nifty Homes.
I thought you said the last guy I just came to was the last delivery. What's this up here? Ooh, what's up here? What's this? The secret? What's going on? Secret? I like secrets. Oh. No, I'll come back later. I have one more delivery to take care of. Get out of here. Oh, okay. I obtained $20. Thought I could have gone that way, but I guess not. They just fast traveled me closer. I love that, actually. Am I supposed to go this way? I want to learn how to drive, but just on stream. I feel like that'd be very funny. Krista! Hello! Everybody! This is Krista. Met her like a couple of days ago. And she's an awesome streamer. She has started. What the heck are these balloons? I'm supposed to give them to people. And that is what I'm currently doing right now.
It's supposed to be funny. Boys, I think this man wants to take a swim.
It's supposed to be for you. Oh, okay, okay. Oh.
I just got word from Donovan.
Get me up there, come on. I don't have a wheel on my car. Damn. I need to go somewhere else. And I'm drifting because my car doesn't have a wheel. How you doing today, Krista? How's your day going? Let me give you a shout out. Everyone go say hi to Krista. Go give her a follow. She just started streaming like this month or like a couple of months ago, which is pretty crazy. And she's doing fantastic. Ooh. Okay, they they made me laugh, and thank you for the intro. I'm good. How about you? Yeah, so sweet. Thank you. Like a month ago. Yes, my day is going great. I'm just getting bullied by my chat, and it's hot now, and so I'm just starting to sweat because it's starting to get hot. But besides that, everything is going a-okay. We just chatting and drinking water and being productive. Where am I even supposed to go? Oh, I got to release it. I got to release the parcel. Okay. How do I do that? Oh, there you go. I did it.
Who knows, Winston? Aim for the stars. And perhaps.
How's your day going, though? I just been home all day.
Fortunate enough to step into these shoes of mine. Just imagine the privilege of taking over my role with all its crucial responsibilities.
Oh no. Is that plus they made me do 20 sit-ups, which I didn't want to do, but I had to.
That would really be hitting the career.
It made me do 20 sit-ups and then instantly just broke out into a sweat because it's already hot. So yeah, that's what happened. How do I get back home? Good. Now I'm just crashing into everything. Definitely taking a shower today.
Winston, are you there, my boy?
Yes, I'm here. Those stairs are steep. How you walking down those? That's crazy. The fact they even made stairs.
Like Johnny. All right, Winston. See you tomorrow.
That was pretty clean. That was clean. Okay, that was some perfect driving right there. Not gonna lie, that was clutch. That's pretty good. The fox. Ooh,
Winston, where are you, you little weasel?
He's sleeping, for heaven's sake. Calm down. Frank, why are you holding a rifle?
Oh, you stay out of this, Ellie. He had one damn job. One. Now the hen house looks like the goddamn Battle of Gettysburg.
He's just a child.
That's not
what
funny.
Are you doing?
Well, maybe if you'd stop encouraging him to build all those useless gadgets and gizmos, he'd get some actual work done around here.
Frank!
I told you to secure that fence, boy. Now get up.
Huh? What?
All right.
Oh, there's a flashback.
You're gonna take that rifle.
But it's the middle of the night.
Don't interrupt me, boy. You're gonna track that wretched animal and deal with it. Bet it's holed up in one of those old dens in the woods out back near Ripley's.
What if it has pups?
Now, when you've dealt with it, you're gonna fix that goddamn mess in the hen house. But I don't care if it takes you a week, neither. You understand me, boy?
Yes, sir.
Boy? You understand me, boy? You don't hear that. You don't hear that phrase anymore. You understand me, boy? What's in the newspaper? How did he get his...
Oh, please, not now!
His... rocket back? Excuse me. Jesus Christ. What's happening? An earthquake? What the hell? What just fell out of the sky?
Hey, Norman? it's Winston. Hey, about that roof.
About that roof. Something just fell out of the sky.
Ah, monsoon season. How it saturates the ground and revivifies the colors of nature.
Ooh,
like a glass of icy lemonade under the shade of the magnolia on a hot summer's day. It gives us respite. Some would call it a new beginning. Others, however...
Leave me alone. On a Sunday morning. Really?
The game is called Deliver at All Costs. It's free. Epic Game Store.
Yes.
I'll drop it. I will put it in the chat.
It's raining.
No, it's a disaster.
I'll put it in the chat for you.
Came early.
It's also sun.
Get your ass here right now.
Oh, whoops. It's in your name.
Better put on
Yes,
my
it's in the title as well. That's why I tell people to read the title or in the title. Yes. That's why I tell people to read the title, because I feel like people just don't read the titles, like at all, and they be like, "Oh,
Time to head out.
What's happening? What's going on? I'm like, it's in the title, dude. Not to be rude, but it's like it's there. Like, you know, just saying.
Wow. Thanks a lot, Don.
It was raining. We got new weather. I read it. I just thought maybe you needed to deliver in this game, but something. That. Yes. Sometimes I'm blind. That's hilarious. That's crazy. That honestly, not wrong. Not wrong. How is your day going? What are you doing? What are you up to? How are you spending your Sunday night? She's literally chasing my car right now. I don't know how she's gonna catch me. Sometimes I'm blonde. It's just a crazy sentence. I thought I was stuck. Are you streaming today? Since I know you streamed yesterday. What's today? It's Sunday? It's Sunday, okay. When you don't leave the house, all the days just start to get confusing. All the days just start to... July 12th, 1959, Chapter 3, Winds of Change. It's just all a delivery game. You just deliver stuff to people.
This is like the halibut farce all
Just
over again.
cleaning a bit. Gotta make food soon and warming up my voice. Finishing streaming my song tonight.
What's going on?
Ooh, what's the song?
Until tomorrow when we're fully staffed.
What's the song?
And there is sensitive equipment in
Law, yes,
On top of
it's
that,
Sunday.
warehouse is
I
completely stacked. You
that
can cram a bar of
I
soap.
ask that every day. What is?
Speaking of which,
No, definitely.
I got some urgent
I
calls to make.
thought
Your
Saturday
lifesaver, Winston.
Make yourself
was
useful and go talk to
already
Rowan up on the ranch.
Sunday, and then and then I'm like, wait, why? I'm like, oh wait, no, it's not Sunday, it's Saturday. But I thought Saturday was Sunday, which was very confusing. I'm like, wait, yeah, Sunday fun day, you know it. I think you were
That
there
man is
last
truly
week,
one of a
right?
kind.
Into the
Singing in the rain on a Sunday at work. Morning, Norm.
Into the Sun
Enjoying the
song.
weather?
Good thinking.
Hey man, oh, I love the rain. Heat has been killing me.
Yeah, of course you
I
do.
can't remember.
You, my friend,
Honestly, I can't remember.
You're a bona fide sourpuss.
So
I
that you tell
I
me.
can't remember a lot of things I do.
You think that's why Don hates my guts?
Don is Don.
It's just a blank memory at this point. Maybe not though. It's
I know this
just.
for a fact, though.
Oh, it's just he's
Does
like
not like
medium
being
beat.
lied
I
to.
like
When he's made up his
that
mind,
genre.
he's made
Oh,
up
yeah,
his
my memory's
mind.
not great either. Oh, it's definitely
Good
not
thing
great.
you got me then.
I like that
yin and yang,
genre of
you and I.
music. It's fun.
Personally,
I've been to
always been upfront with
one
him,
rave.
but then again,
That
he's
was
my boss.
cool.
Harold hires all couriers. So
My
he's the
one
one you need
rave,
to worry about. And
which I
know
would
he
never
likes
go
you,
to
so
again
it's all
because it's
good.
not the same.
But you...
Technically, I'm a warehouse operative, but I go where I'm needed. Thought you
The
knew
music
this.
is not the same.
Huh. No.
Well, now you do, my friend. We're riding shotgun today. My truck's in the workshop.
I wish I was as strong as Norman.
What's up this
Can you
ladder?
come up with a solution to all the heavy lifting. I know. Let's try out We Deliver's workshop.
Oh! I just broke my ankle. Get up. Where do we need to go? Enter company car. Ease, what's good, bro? How you doing? Yo, my day's going chill, bro. How about you? How about you? What you up to? I'm assuming you just got home from work. I'm assuming.
All done. Let's try it out on something heavy. Oops.
I actually wanted to go through this. Alright, let's talk to this guy again. Talk to Norman.
Oh, you're back.
Doing well,
Let's get
man.
going.
Thankfully.
What?
I was off work today. Oh, nice. Stay.
Hey, look.
Hello,
Oh,
it's
boy. Here we
my
go.
Saturday.
Gentlemen.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Gerther, don't
Nice,
worry,
nice.
sir.
So
We'll
what
get it up
did
there
you
safe
do today, kid?
and
I
sound.
hope
This
you
is
have a great
seismograph.
game.
It measures.
I know.
Gonna
we're
start making food.
Yeah,
But
very good, Einstein. Then I don't
I'll
have to
alert
remind you
to
not to
support.
mistake it for a
Hope you have
piece
a
of
great
marine
stream. I
equipment.
definitely will. Thank
Seeing as
you
we're
for
practically underwater as it
popping
is.
in. I
Drive it
hope
up there
you
ASAP. Got it.
enjoyed
You'll deliver
your
it to Mount
quick
Callahan's summit.
chat.
And for the love of all that is sacred, be careful.
Appreciate you being here.
Great.
And I'll
on,
catch you on your
Let's go.
stream whenever you stream again. Because I
Alright,
definitely
now grab the
do
hook from the
want to
winch.
play more board games. That was fun.
Okay, need to climb up this rig and run the cable through that loop there.
But enjoy your cooking.
Now let's hook it to this parcel.
Oh, he sounded like Homer
Perfect. Let's test the new controls inside
when
the truck
he
and guide the seismograph
fell
onto the flatbed.
down. I was not paying attention to him at all. Was I supposed to? I was not paying attention to him. Oh, I was not listening. Okay, that's what happens when you don't pay attention because I don't know what I'm doing now. Thanks for the stream. Thank you. Agreed. It was fun playing buddy games. We may do it again. But I'll definitely be there. This game is about delivering packages to people, and there is also a story behind the main character. So far, I don't know too much because we just started playing the game. And I feel like I don't know what I'm supposed to do because I wasn't paying attention. I fell again. Nice. Okay, caught up then. Yeah, basically, yeah. I didn't really do much. I got up to chapter 3 and now I'm stuck because I wasn't listening to what the guy was trying to tell me. So I don't know what to do. I'm assuming I'm supposed to... Nope.
Whoops.
I got this. Hold on. I'm gonna figure this out. It can't be that hard. Nope. Damn. Okay. Shit. Okay. Damn. Damn. Okay. I'm just... Alright. This way, yeah. Back, yeah. This gotta be 10 times harder in real life. Because I'm struggling just in game. This gotta be 10 times harder in real life. This is not easy right now. Okay. 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 We did it! Let's go! Okay, that took us way too long, but we did it, and I'm proud of myself.
Great.
That myself. Sometimes it can be easier in real life. Oh, but
Oh, come on. One last delivery, and then we're done.
I don't
for
have
the
my
day.
license, and I never drove I never drove a car, and if you really want me to be open, I recently just pumped gas.
How did you get so
like
handy with technology anyway?
Oh, I've always been
like
interested in, well, all kinds of
2
stuff
years ago.
ever since I was a kid.
Like I never
Did your
pumped
parents
gas
encourage you?
in my life until like
Not my dad, that's for sure. Except when he was
until
helping the
like
farm.
last year.
Let's say he wasn't exactly
Like
thrilled
I don't know
going
shit
off to
about
study
cars.
so far from home.
I understand.
Okay,
My
I just
father
did
was furious
okay.
when I left home.
This is like a arcade game at this point right now.
You haven't talked to him since?
That's crazy. Although my mom
Never
had
got
me
the chance.
pumping gas
He got
at
sick
like 8.
while I was in the
Yeah, nah,
Pacific,
bro.
and the enemy
Nah,
wasn't
bro.
slowing down.
My
So
mom
neither could
was
we.
always afraid
that's
to
rough.
get behind
Don't be.
the wheel
I can help,
after
and it taught me a lot. I tell
after
you, Winston,
she got
with all that
into a
ugliness
big
everywhere around
car
me,
crash.
it showed me the real difference. A
And
smile
I just
or a nice
never
word can make.
really had a lot of friends that drove when I was younger. Plus in the part of NYC that I live at, you don't really need cars that much. You can just take the train, you can take the bus, you can take a cab, you know, but I should really take my driver's test one day. That'd be pretty cool. I still need to get my passport as well. Mind you, I'm gonna be 27 soon, and I still don't have a passport, and I think that's pretty crazy to think about. No? Yes? Maybe? What do you think? I don't know. Ooh, that's crazy. That's very glad. Nah, facts.
Oh no. Local tremors are setting off landslides. If
I
we're not
would
careful,
like
we
to
will get
drive.
crushed.
My sister tells me constantly if I just had
The
my
seismograph is
driver's
responding to the tremors.
l-
The alert
my
when its lights
driver's
blink and the needle starts recording.
thing, I could have been driving, but I just don't have a license, and I keep failing the damn. I keep failing the freaking writing test, which is not that hard, apparently, but I failed it every time. And now they want you to be on camera for people won't cheat, and that sucks because all my friends got it now, and I'm the only one that don't have it. Which I'm not really like mad about because like cars are really expensive and I don't really go anywhere. But I could start going places if I did have a car, and now I'm dead. I got an achievement though. Dive bomb delivery.
Survived that somehow.
Yeah, I don't know how we survived that. We driving in the midst of a rock slide. Like y'all crazy for that.
There is another road further west, though. It must be those.
I almost
machines
fell
they're
off the
using up
cliff.
top that's causing this.
Oh, I was supposed to go.
This is no
Wait.
time for one-handed driving.
Why am I one-handed drive? Oh, okay. I was blocked off. Oh shit.
Eyes on the road, Winston.
Oh no, don't push me off. No! Oh, let's go, we made it. We didn't die. Oh, we fucking made it. Let's go. I need to go that way. I'm going back down to turn around. Yeah. Oh shit! It hit me right on top of the hood. Right on top of the hood engine. It just smacked me. Oh, well, okay. Can't do that either. I was getting there, guys. You could have just let me get there. I was getting there. It just takes me a while. Mentally and physically. Oh no, I fell off again. Damn. This is where everything just goes to shit. That's where everything goes to shit. This is where everything just goes downhill for me. This is where everything just goes downhill. This is where I just start just saying nonsense. Oh my god. I can make it up the cliff like I can make up your mom. Oh, we still got it. Let's go. Oh, you... Okay. Can we fix our car? Okay. We got this. We got this. We got this. We got this. Don't hit me. We got this. We got this. No! We got this. I gotta fix my other wheel. No, fix the other wheel. Don't fall in the car. Oh my god. Damn it. God, damn it. Damn it. Damn it. No. No. Oh my god. Oh my god. You mother! Oh god. Okay.
Barely made it out of that.
This rock slide is crazy. I'm gonna drive. I'm gonna drive your car. Watch. I'm gonna start fucking drifting and shit. I'm gonna start drifting. I'm gonna start doing donuts. Come on, dude. Stop.
Just my luck.
No. Just my luck indeed. Oh! Damn it. No. Yeah. This is more fun trying just to make it instead of just like instead of just actually trying to get there. Because the explosion of the car, pretty funny to watch. Just right on the side of the wall. There you go. That's a strat. 20. Don't time it. You're not supposed to time it. Don't time it. God damn it. That song takes like 20 minutes. What the hell? No, don't. What the fuck, bro? Why is it the hardest part of the game? Hopefully you manage when this finishes. What do you mean manage? Manage what? And oh, don't fall. Great for that game. We made it! Let's go! Took us 20 tries. But we made it. Okay, now, okay. That's, okay. I'm assuming this is like a 3-point turn. This takes place in 1959. I think my mom was born that year. She was. How do I hitch? How do I do this? How do I attach it? Grab the winch. Okay, climb up the ladder. It just got so quiet now. That's how loud that damn sound alert is.
Took it to this parcel.
That's how loud it is.
Jump into the car and use my fancy controls to unload the parcel.
Why am I still driving?
Oh, man.
Why would I put it on the floor?
Right.
Out of all
My
places.
back is acting up again. Is it okay if I stay in the car while you get the guy to sign off?
What did you do today, Deez? How did you spend your day off? What did you get up to? What's life like for you on a day off? What do you be doing?
Hey, are you the boss around here?
Hmm? Oh, yes, I'm afraid so.
I need you to sign for the delivery we just made.
Oh, excellent! Must be the new seismograph. It really is a remarkable machine, you know.
No, I guess it takes a geologist to get excited about tremors that are too weak for the rest of us to even notice.
Oh, I'm not a geologist.
So what are you?
No, why are you here then?
I'm a chaos theorist. I'm
That's
here
a
to say
thing.
that.
The magma?
That's part of it, no doubt. I'm studying
That
the
word
molten
sounds
core,
made
the
up.
most chaotic system on this planet. Constantly in motion, impossible to predict. Able to raise or flatten mountains, but ultimately controlled by the smallest of particles.
Where have I heard this before?
In a science fiction novel.
This is God's great mirror for humanity, reminding us of how the ripples of our actions spread outward. But we aren't God, so how to tell
Nope,
what
but
action we should take?
people like
And
to
if we
pretend
made a
they're God.
mistake, would we even be able to tell? The data tells me that entropy is acting faster than it should here. It seems deliberate, but could I ever know what the effects will be? I'm sorry, I'm droning on. Here, signed. Thank you, sir.
Oh,
You
my
look
chest is
familiar.
popped.
Do I know you from somewhere?
I don't think so. No, I've got one of those familiar faces.
I need a shower.
Thanks. You take care now.
Talk to scientists. Delivered. Is there anything else? We respawn 10 times and hit something 58 times or something.
We head back, if you've got the time.
Can I like fast travel?
Why don't you turn west when we're down from the mountain? Head towards the mainland as far west as you can, and I'll tell you where to stop.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Be careful.
Don't tell me what to do. Okay, I gotta go all the way over there.
Hey,
How did I
the
crash?
rain finally get to you or what?
Nah, man. Don't worry about it.
Never let me in your car. Never let me in. Never let me in your driver's seat.
Exactly what I needed, I think.
Who are you? What do you want?
The
You
name's
look
Raymond J.
drunk.
Parker. Perhaps you've heard of me. I propose a duel. My parachute versus your pickup down the treacherous roads of Mount Callan.
There's a race? It's a race. I don't want to race you now, but another time, that'd be great.
Winston.
I'm busy right now. I got some things to take care of. I was trying to just hit it.
Got quite busy up at the sun.
You could have made that. You could have made that.
Got quite busy up at the summit.
You can't go down the rocks. You can drive down the rocks. I don't feel like it's that difficult.
Be careful.
It's not active or anything, right?
Huh?
I mean, it's not gonna, you know.
Oh, it's active for sure. Gives us a good shake every other year or so. But there hasn't been a large eruption in recorded history. So,
Jesus.
What are the chances it happens right now?
There's always a chance.
Right.
Oh, damn. Okay. I was flying. Oh. Thank you. Oh. That made my heart jump a little bit. Like, I felt that a little bit. I felt that. Reef side. Are we still not there yet? This map is pretty big for a indie game, because I don't think a triple title studio made this. It's like a, say this is like a very small studio. I'm not gonna lie, this game is fun. I don't know where I'm driving at. Where am I? All you see is my shadow. Am I in the water? I hit the water. I just drowned myself. Which is not a good way to go. Honestly, that's like probably one of the worst ways to go. It's just drowning by water. Not what you would want to recommend to yourself.
My bad.
Can I say that I am partially blind now? Since I already have the job? You know, like, can I still get away? Okay.
You're quite the driver, Winston.
I'm the best driver. Don't get it twisted. No one can drive like me, right? And that's a compliment.
Let's take a left over there.
What's gotten into him?
Damn.
Am I supposed to talk to him? I am.
Rare earth minerals. That's what this whole enterprise is really about.
The volcano.
Uh-huh. The harbor expansion project went belly up. Railway companies are struggling. So this is what we're left with. Winds of change. Winston.
Erbium. Neodymium. Rasiodimium, maybe.
I'm sorry?
Nah, never mind. Just reminded me of something I used to work on.
Man, I feel bad for Harold. They're gonna grind this pearl up and spit it out into the ocean.
Yeah, he really loves this place, huh? If I've learned anything the past few years, it's that some things are just out of our control.
Didn't take you for a stoic, Winnie.
Yeah, if only that were true.
Anyway, enough moping. Just wanted to show what's on people's minds nowadays. You being new to the island and all.
Appreciate it, Norm.
Come on, man. Let's head back.
What? You're not tired of this lovely weather, are you?
Very funny. Was that driving or time travel?
Winds of Chaos. Go to
the driver, Winston.
I'm not good. I'm excellent. Phenomenal. Astounding. Fabulous. Glorious. Victorious. There's a lot of words I can use. And they can all mean the same thing. It just means you're great. Good.
I'll head up to the office. You coming with?
I'll be right behind you.
This game is fun. I don't know how many times I said that already. Who knew I would like this game? I just looked at it. I'm like, oh, it's free. I'm gonna try it. Then it turned out to be a good game.
Give me a sec to finish up this memo, and I'm all yours.
Of course, sir. No Donovan in sight. Thank God.
Yeah, I don't like him either. It's kind of rude for like no reason. And people that are rude for no reason definitely got something going on at home or in their personal life.
There we go. Well, forgive me for bringing you in on a Sunday like this. As a way of thanks, you will have tomorrow off with full payment.
That's it. W boss.
It's the least I could do. Everything would have gone
W
to hell in a
boss.
handbasket if you didn't come. No one else answered the phone. Could hardly blame them. Oh, golly, here we go again. Whoa.
Another earthquake?
Well, wasn't that exciting?
That's one way to put it.
There we go, gentlemen. That should do it, yes?
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Harold.
Now, it's getting late, my friends. Let's close up shop and call it a day, shall we?
Now perhaps I can at last settle my outstanding bill with the landlord.
Oh my god, yes, alright. Go outside. Confined by rent. We've been back, dude. In the game and in life.
Oh shit, man.
What?
Hello,
I
Alice.
have no way of getting home. Car broke down over at the old diner.
Oh, well, what's wrong with it?
Beats me. Just wouldn't start.
Want me to take a look at it?
Would you?
Yeah, of course.
You're the best, Winnie. Okay, let's get going.
Walk to the old diner. I miss classic diners. They were so nice, so welcoming, so warming. It's like they still got those places, but it's pretty rare. It's pretty rare.
This is Bessie.
The one and only. Isn't she
Betsy is a trash heap that needs to go
Sure
in a
is
fucking
something, all
dumpster.
right.
Where she live, Dr. Green?
Oh, that's surely a matter of debate. Huh, what's this? Well, that's a first.
What the hell?
Are you a boot short, Norman?
How do you
Not
get
my
a boot?
size, but thanks for checking.
Well, let's just, put it over there, in case someone comes looking.
Good idea. She's all yours, Winnie.
Oh, what a great honor, sir.
Woohoo! And so it lives to die another day.
No, we're not home yet.
True that. Thanks, man. Guess I could have solved that myself. Didn't
Yeah,
have
you
time
really
to check
could.
under the hood this morning.
I don't know why. I don't know why you needed to call me, but I appreciate the call.
Nah, don't mention it.
Hey, thanks for driving me home. You know, in case something else happens.
Not at all.
Appreciate it. You hungry?
Oh, I'm starving.
Me too. Stay for dinner, why don't you?
Yeah? Who's cooking?
I'm messing up this man's
Fiona?
car like
What?
crazy.
Then yes.
Come on, man. It was just that one time. Promise I'll go easier on the chili from here on out.
Uh-huh. Yeah, my butt's highly skeptical of that statement.
Whatever, man.
His car, after I'm done, needs to be totaled and compound, because it won't be able to drive again.
Be careful.
Oh no, oh don't fall. We made it home, safe and sound, Norman.
Man, I'm beat.
Yeah.
He has stairs outside of his house going
Oh,
inside
what's
the house.
inside?
That's pretty cool. Never seen that.
Hi, darling.
Dinner's ready.
Thank you.
Oh, what they eating? What a nice family. No, I'm back home.
Sweet
Yes, I
home.
am. Home, sweet home. I want to see if we can go get that toolbox. I actually don't know where he pointed at, but I don't know why I need to do that when I could just climb this ladder right here. Ooh, okay. Oh, parkour, baby! We made it. I hope I think I'm going the right way. To get the crate or the tool chest, whatever you want to call it. I already opened this. Is there another one that I don't know about? I think there's another one that I don't know about. That's around here.
Careful, sport.
I'm loving the camera angles too. It's not that much, but it's something.
You got them.
Oh yeah,
Yes,
got them.
child. Now remember, stay light on your feet. Those worms, they're always listening.
Okay, thank you for the advice. Oh, we got our first blueprint. Hydraulic doors blueprint. Nice, okay. We just got some nice doors. Pretty cool.
I'm soaked. Definitely need a change of clothes.
You don't make nothing to like snack on or eat or like use the bathroom. You just go straight to sleep.
Time to catch some Z's.
I love how we both yawn at the same time. Oh, we getting watched. Who's watching us? Is that the Secret Service? Is that the CIA?
As the clock ticked off, Winston found his rhythm, keeping his head down and steering clear of Donovan whenever possible. He seemed to have accepted his circumstances. All things considered, things looked up for our dear Winston. Alas, pacified as it may have been, the beast would nevertheless remain somewhere deep within the tenebrous vestiges of his soul, biding its time. For isn't this the plight of every man, to obdurately, yet in futility, struggle against nature twofold? The one within, and the one in which we live.
So if I understand you correctly, Dr. Conway, the rare minerals in our island's soil, a result of the tectonic activity in this very region, is vital to your research?
That's right. You could say that St. Monique is quite literally the crucible for this technological pursuit.
And a final question, a lot of people are worried about how this mining will impact our environment.
Rest assured, we work well within the confines of environmental guidelines and procedures.
Well, that's it, ladies and gentlemen. Our interview with Dr. Craig Conway, spokesperson of the Atomic Energy Commission's Stell Tech Division.
You just got a letter. I wonder who it's from.
Never late, never early, just in time. What the?
Some play of words there, but I get it. It's kind of corny, but if it works, it works, right? He wants to be a science space engineer. He's working with the rockets. I'm assuming he wants to be a space engineer person.
So many ads for mainland companies. Damn, this is bad. Really bad.
That's just a scratch.
We get new doors. Yes, doors, please. I like the little animation. No, oh, wait, what's this? No, that's the same thing. I didn't mean to go back. Beep beep. I wish the horn was louder. It's not that loud. My eyes are getting heavy. Well, that man is for sure dead. Welcome, 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 welcome. Yeah. Knees weak. Arms spaghetti. I never knew the lyrics to that song. Arms are heavy. Oh, knees weak. Arms are heavy. That's like the only part I can remember. Like, as much songs and music that I listen to, my brain cannot remember lyrics to a whole song to save my life. Like, I cannot remember the chorus, the hook. I can't. Like, my brain is just dog shit at that. Like, it's just bad. Kind of sucks because there's people that can literally rap a whole song off the top of their dome. And like, I can't do that. I can't do that. Like, I don't have the ability at all to do that. Like, they can like rap a song that they just heard from their favorite person just off rip. I'm like, okay.
It seems you think rather
I missed out on that talent.
Perhaps if I demonstrated how to use this
Arms
baton,
are heavy.
it would change your mind. Ha! Gotcha! You You should see the look on your face. I'm only joking, of course.
Uh-huh.
Come now. To answer your question, though,
Do you have a talent, Jesus?
The boss has me noting arrivals and departures. Too many employees are lollygagging in the break room while on the clock, see?
Whatever you say.
Do you have a talent?
I should check in with Harold.
Harold. Or drive someone insane. I can beatbox. And I used to be able to suck my. Alright, then not have to know the last part.
Tape fixes everything.
But the beatboxing is pretty cool though. That's pretty sick. You don't really see a lot of people beatboxing that much anymore. That's like a trend that like came and left. Both is cool, don't lie. Sure, I guess. Girls, here we go. Girls would say, "Let me peg you," but when you tell them you can suck your own dick, they're like, "What?" Never mind. Crazy, right? I know. These standards we live in are crazy.
I look out my bedroom window over the boardwalk and the busy streets, and I don't recognize this place anymore. My home, everything's just vacant. And I look at Donnie, and I don't recognize him either. My own son. What would you have done?
That's crazy. Like, oh, that's interesting. You're very flexible, I see. But you ain't flexible on me.
You, my love? What about you?
That's what she be saying. So I see. You're very flexible with yourself, huh? But not with me, I see. Okay. I see how it is. Oh, he overheard the conversation, but I was not listening. When I was skinnier.
Prowling around, are you? What the? Today's deliveries. Johnny's waiting. Get it done.
Now we're getting the beer belly and getting old. Got old. Got all of them gears. You're not that old. Well, that's what you claim anyway. 26 is not old.
Tomorrow it's finally
A little
here.
older than
My
you.
yearly fishing vacation.
Yeah, by not that much.
By the water at my favorite spot.
Probably by like a couple of months.
Everything to be in perfect order when I come back. Get your company car and radio me when you're ready for the next delivery.
Alright, cause 98, 15. Okay, on this same year, just in September. It's September 25th. 98. Same year, just different months. As I said, you are a couple of months older than me. We were born the same year, we were just born in 2 different months.
I should find my pickup truck before I use the radio. Got another delivery for me?
No delivery.
Winston, I've got another job for you. Head on over to the town square in St. Monique City.
Is this a scratch?
We are certainly getting there. But honestly, I don't know how my 30s are even going to be, and I don't even want to talk about that.
Replacing that old statue of the town's founder.
The vampire and Jesus.
But before he will pay me to erect the new one, he wants you to get rid of the old one. Right. Just attach the chain to the winch on your car. Then you can use the car to pull the statue down.
Get lost profit. I'm messing up this church like crazy. This is how I do my job. And I'm supposed to winch it on. Yeah, I'm supposed to winch it on. The thing is, yeah. No, don't get back in the car.
Now get back in the car. You should be able to pull that thing along behind you.
I gotta pull it?
Take that old coprolite down to the stonecutters west of Mount Callahan.
I think, do I bring the statue with me? I don't know. I think I bring it with me. Just in case, we could bring it with us.
My bad.
I don't know what I'm doing for. I don't know what I'm doing for my birthday. I honestly don't really care, really. Just another year.
As a child, I remember thinking the town's founder had suffered from a severe case
Am I going the right way? Yeah. Excuse me, come through. I messed up that. I messed up that dude's car. I almost killed that. Almost killed that girl. Excuse me, coming through. And the statue is almost completely broken. Completely broken statue. Almost. Excuse me, car. Coming through. Ooh, there's a big money pile. I wonder what that's all about. Can I get in here? I can't drive up here. Okay. What's this? A money briefcase.
A store, huh?
Ooh.
Let's see what's inside.
Wait, we can buy a store? Shops. Shops are scattered across the world, offering a variety of parts for assembling gadgets and occasionally special items that can aid in completing encounters. Okay.
Check out my inventory.
Alright, let's see what you got. $500. Airbags is 1,000. Time control is 1,000. Wheel spikes is 800. Hell horn is 500. Circuit board is 500. The brains of any operation. The heat. Spare parts, a battery, rope, duct tape, hitchhike, bike. Oh, we can ride. Oh, we can ride a bike. Good for getting into shape and absolutely nothing else. I want a bike. You just bought a bike for the fuck of it. Hey, look at my bike.
Company car.
Alright, but I can't like pick up my bike though. Can I like get my bike? Like it better be in my house. Like I bought that bike. I better see it. Better see it at my property, because that $500 was not a waste. That is good, hard working money. Well, I think he's no longer gonna have
Never mind.
car insurance.
That thing was mostly feathers and droppings by this point.
Well, oh, the controller disconnected. Plug it back in. Switch it to. This game is really fun, really chaotic, but has a good storyline, graphics, build, style, characters. are cool. The environment is pretty lively and is really colorful. These people knew what they were doing. These are some very sharp turns. Ooh, going back up here again. Ooh. Oh shit. Oh damn. Oh damn. Damn. Okay. Oh, that's molten lava. Damn. Oh. Ooh. Am I supposed to go this way? I don't know. I think you're supposed to go the other way. Yeah, you're supposed to go the other way. Damn. Okay, nope. Damn. Okay. Ooh. Ooh. Alright, we made it. Oh, we made it clean in. I'm supposed to carry this shit all the way back down to town.
Why, hello there, citizen.
You can't make this
Mayor
Eugene
Eugene Adams. I take it you are to collect the new monument? Sure. Splendid. I'll go ahead and wait in the car while you sort it out.
I'll leave you right here, motherfucker. This is a crazy run right now.
Not every day you have the mayor as a passenger, huh? I decided that on this momentous occasion, it behooved me to supervise the process. Damn it, courier, seems those gulls have found their new favorite privy.
Why?
Oh, forget it. I won't display a statue that is more than half guano.
Oh.
Oh, yikes. Damn it, courier, seems those gulls have found their new favorite privy. Any chance you could speed this up?
I'm trying to. Do you see how I'm driving right now?
Good people of Saint Monique waiting. Oh, forget it. I won't display a statue that is more than half guano. Damn it, courier, seems those gulls have found their new favorite privy.
These birds are annoying. Just like all birds.
Swerve, boy! Swerve! Our dear founder was actually a forefather of mine. That's why I took the liberty of posing for the statue myself. Oh, not again! Do you have any idea how difficult that stuff is to get off?
I was like, no matter what you do, you just gotta be faster than them. I missed one though. Oh my god, they still caught me. Can we just get there already? Like, I have this shit, I'm in the fucking dirt. Now we have some fucking time. This mission sucks. Birds suck. Bro, birds are annoying.
That is more than half guano.
I'm doing so bad that they just mean we just cut through most of this shit and I fail to even go the right direction. Something I would totally do. Seagulls are the worst type of birds in existence. They're annoying and they're pests.
Oh, not again! Do you have any idea how difficult that stuff is to get off?
No. And I can really care less right now. I'm just trying to make it over, dude.
Now, winch up the statue onto the pedestal.
Stupid birds. I don't care if that shit's dirty. Honestly, don't give a fuck.
Space, please. Not so fast, cowboy. Oops, sorry. Watch it, Sparky. Oops.
That's the only way I can make it get it to the front. These birds are still on me. That's crazy. That mission sucked.
You did a good deed today, citizen.
You're welcome.
Can anybody do this mission perfectly?
Make sure you wash the car off at the end of the day, Winston.
Cause that shit looks crazy. That shit full white. You click on that? Secret car, special car. Oh, there's a special cars? I don't see any in the map though. So where do we go now? Do we go home? Just doing donuts. Got $300. Oh. Damn, son, where you get that? Or where you find that? I think that's how the saying goes. How did I get, how, what, how? Why did I get myself confused like that?
Oh, I can't use this right now.
Mr. Green, Donovan's waiting for you in Harold's office. Or is it Don's office now? Well, I digress. Apparently, the old geezer had some kind of a nervous breakdown. Did you hear?
Harold, and he's the one who writes your paychecks, not Donovan. Show some respect.
My sincerest apologies. If I had known you two were so close.
Fuck you, Gordon. Donovan sucks.
I'm always the last to know.
I'm always the last to know.
Come in. I understand, Ellison.
Considering the circumstances, the board considers Mr. Johnson at this time.
What circumstances? That's ridiculous. He's worked here for years. Besides, he could do his job in his sleep. Not to be confused by some of the staff who actually sleeps on the job.
I'm just giving you the lay of the land.
Ooh, we got drama.
And the nature of Mr. Johnson's employment makes his quotas difficult.
I need him, Allison. I'm asking you to reconsider.
I'll try. No promises. Gotta go. Talk soon.
Let's get down to brass tacks. There's something off about you, kid. I just know it.
What the hell are you talking about, Donovan?
You've been here, what, 7, 8 months now?
What of it?
I've been doing the rounds, so to speak. Asking questions about you. No one seems to know a damn thing about you. Not even Norman. And you two seem to be getting on like a house on fire.
Oh, are you jealous?
Careful, Winston. How come a man such as yourself finds himself as a glorified paperboy so far from home?
Why do you care? I fail to see how that's any of your business.
That's where you're wrong, Winston. Let me explain. I'm not a kind man.
Clearly.
I am a motivated man. As a businessman, I'll do what needs to be done to fix this company. I will get rid of the obstacles, the wastage, the inefficiencies. And as it stands, I'm in the difficult position of having to let people go. People I trust. You may be clever, and a good courier even. Oh, but I trust you about as much as a penguin trusts a shark as a swimming buddy.
You seem to be a little confused. So, let me help you out. I don't work for you, Donovan. I work for Harold.
Oh, believe me, that's been made abundantly clear to me. But for how long? And then what? An opportunity came across my desk some time ago. Initially, I deemed it too fraught with risk, hardly worth it. However, certain undesirable events has left me to reconsider. That can't be helped, of course. The man does what he has to retain what's rightfully his. Wouldn't you agree? Now, get the hell out of my office.
Donovan, you're a bitch.
Packed and ready for tomorrow. But before that, Winston, I will go out and start the fire.
Huh, okay.
Radio me when you're ready.
Copy, copy.
set for the next delivery.
Can we go home? I want to see if I have my bike. My house don't. Oh, it does show up on the map. I'm gonna say my house doesn't show up on the map at all. Can I do like waypoints? I cannot do waypoints. I just have to find my house.
Hey, got another delivery for me?
This is a act of war, Winston. That finless little sardine just in time is planning to out us as the undisputed big fish in this pond. How? By drowning us in flyers, like throwing chum in the water. What a amateur. Time to get our hands dirty with some precious fishing, Johnny. Alright, one more delivery mission. One more delivery mission.
Do you see these, Winston? These are flyers advertising those big mainland companies. With the highway soon to open, they are preparing to come in here and pouch our customers. They plan on airdropping these all over town today. On a Sunday, can you imagine? Listen to me, Winston. I refuse to take this line down. You are to collect as many of these as possible before they are delivered to people. Bring them back here, to me, you understand? Feel free to catch as many as you can handle, but remember, no dropping them.
This is a crazy time.
In one sweep or make several trips. Your call.
I got 3 minutes to pick up 4 boxes, collect and bring the crates. I can't even see what I'm doing. God, this is so weird. Bro, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. Shut up. I know what I'm trying to do. It's not easy. So be quiet. Where's this damn plane go? Bro, this plane is deep. How the fuck?
I hear the planes overhead. They are coming back around for another volley.
God, I'm so terrible at driving. It's ridiculous. Just get in the freaking... Oh, come on, bro. Shut up, lady. I have like a minute left. I'm doing terrible. Bro, he driving to like the next town over. Come on! These are taking forever. That 4 boxes? I don't know. Can I only collect 2? Dude, I'm so bad at this.
He's catching them.
Okay, 3. Oh my god. Oh my god. It's like I never played a damn driving game before.
I have as many as I need now.
I'm not gonna even make it in time. I have like 20 seconds left. Bro, why? Oh my god. Can you not? I don't know how to even get back. We made it! 7 seconds! We made it in 7 seconds. 7 seconds. That's actually very scary. Could have had to redo the mission. But we made it in time.
Towards the steps. Chase after them. I bet they plan on drenching all of Main Street in handouts next.
This man's annoying. I want to quit. I don't want to be... don't want to be working for this man, bro. I think I need faster wheels.
There! Do you see them? They're about to begin dropping their leaflets. Drop me off by the footbridge, then get out there and start catching flyers.
This man has problems. Damn, we hit the bottom.
What are you waiting for? Go
I gotta do
out there and collect those flyers. My bad. Oops.
Oh my god. I'm so bad.
Shipping included in purchases above. Winston, you better be catching every one of these leaflets, you hear? Whoops.
Okay. I don't want to do this mission no more. It's kind of annoying. Because I can't seem to know how to drive a damn truck properly. I have 3, I need 2 more. This game don't make driving this car very easy. Shut up, Johnny, you annoying sack of shit. You're annoying.
Time to turn them in.
He is that one boss that his whole life is the fucking job. And those people are annoying. I'm about to collect you and then throw you in the fire. Well, bro, it's 3 AM. I'm off to bed. Big goose. Bet. Have a good sleep. I'll catch you tomorrow. Catch you on the Monday. I've been going for 6 hours right now. Yes, you already know. You know I'll be in there the minute I wake up. The minute I wake up, I'm in your stream. You already know. This better be the last one. Dedicated. Facts. Facts. I hope this is the last mission.
There they are. Drop me off down by the beach.
Cause it's 10 o'clock and I want to stop streaming already. drop Johnny. Oh, gotcha. I ran her over completely. Is he gonna make another fire pit? Yes, he is.
What are you waiting for?
Your mom to call me. That's what I'm waiting for. For your mom to call. Alright, I want this last one just to be very simple. I just gotta drive backwards and then everything is solid. It's so. Why is it so hard to parallel?
Every payload you miss means we lose another customer.
Bro, shut up. You're dropping them in the most weirdest spots.
Got brakes.
Where is he? God damn it, bro. Freak.
Just throw those on the bonfire.
F4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I just dropped all of them, bro. I can't.
Yes, burn! I'll see all of you burn. I'll rid the world of your 2-for-1 coupons and your frequent customer rewards.
Sit down. It's raining crates.
Damn it. Bro, I'm doing so bad. It's ridiculous. So much things in the way. Too many people in my way. Too many pedestrians.
It's no use. The town is already inundated with leaflets and posters.
Alright, we're doing this right this time. We need 6 boxes. I don't know where he's dropping. What? Wait, where are they? Yo, one takes forever to drop down. Okay, that's 3. Okay, we need 3 more. Bro, why are you going so deep? Nah, this man went to West the bubble fucking back right now.
What's your problem?
Get mom. Oh, come on. I don't have time for this. Bro, where is it? These crazy want to take their sweet ass time and shit.
I have as many as I need now.
Alright, that's it. This mission sucks. Nine seconds. This better be the last one. I don't like this mission.
Yes! Look at him turning tail and leaving. Seems like they finally realized it was pointless. You know, Winston, many of the greatest generals of history came from humble beginnings. It was through the demand of command that they showed their mettle. It's the same way with me, Winston. I didn't know I possessed this tactical genius until I needed it.
Are we done with him? Because that mission was ass. Highest stack 5, respawn 1 time. This game auto saves as well. So we gotta save it right here. Think it. Oh no, you can save it here too just in case. Excuse me. Alright, I'm rating out. Who is ever still here? Thank you everybody who came in today. Thank you for the bits. Thank you for all the chats. Thank you for all the love. But we're gonna rate out. Let's see who's on right now. Where's the raid button? Oh, why not read these? He will start his stream soon. My ears almost itchy. Yeah, we're reading these. These nuts in your mouth. Alright guys, I'll see y'all tomorrow. Be safe and have a good sleep. For the people I won't see.